Picture this. You're reading through a job description, or maybe you're diving into a new tech article, and you stumble across the words Unix and Linux, and suddenly you find yourself pausing and thinking, wait a minute, are those actually the same thing? Are they totally different? And honestly, which one even matters today? Look, if you've ever felt completely lost by that kind of industry jargon, let me tell you, you are definitely not alone.
So many people confuse these two, and honestly, it makes total sense why. They sound incredibly similar, they get tossed around in the exact same conversations, and they both live primarily in that text-based command line world. But I can absolutely promise you that by the end of this explainer, you're going to know exactly what they are, how they differ, and why understanding that difference is just a massive advantage if you're working anywhere near technology. So let's jump right in.
All right, to really understand where we are today, we need to kick things off with part 1, the original blueprint. So let's travel back in time to the late 1960s. Inside AT&T Bell Labs, software engineers were dealing with a massive headache. Computers back then were gigantic, they were incredibly expensive, and the worst part, every single one of them ran a completely different operating system. If you wrote a piece of software for one machine, it was totally trapped there. But that all changed in 1969 when Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie created Unix. It was a brilliant invention, and spoiler alert, decades later in 1991, it would ultimately inspire the creation of Linux.
You can kind of think of Unix like the ultimate, well-designed Swiss Army knife. Because it was written in the C programming language, it was incredibly portable. You could literally take the source code, compile it for a completely different machine, and boom, it just worked. It was built on this beautifully simple philosophy: do one thing and do it really, really well. Unix introduced these foundational concepts that we still use every single day. Things like the file system tree, user permissions, the terminal shell. It literally became the DNA of modern operating systems.
Now, Unix completely changed computing forever, but it definitely wasn't the end of the story. Which brings us to Part 2, the open source rebel.
Fast forward to 1991. There's this young Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds, and he was getting super frustrated with the restrictions of his university's teaching operating system. He wanted to build something entirely from scratch, so he goes onto an internet forum and posts this: "I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional." And it is just wild to look back at that quote today, because that little hobby went on to literally power the internet and run space missions. He called his creation Linux.
But okay, right here is where we absolutely need to clear up the biggest misconception out there. Linus was heavily inspired by Unix, for sure. He wanted his system to behave like Unix, using similar commands and a similar structure. But here is the crucial takeaway. Linux was written entirely from scratch. It didn't use a single line of original Unix code. It's kind of like, think of Unix as this legendary secret family recipe. Linux is a chef who meticulously studied that recipe and then cooked up something very similar, but it's entirely their own distinct creation. Linux is what the industry calls Unix-like. It looks and feels similar, but under the hood, it is not Unix.
So how do they actually differ in everyday practice? Let's get into Part 3, the head-to-head showdown. The biggest, most fundamental difference between the two comes down to ownership and cost. Unix is proprietary. That means it's owned by corporations, it requires really expensive licenses, and its source code is strictly closed. Linux, on the flip side, is open source. Anyone in the world can read, modify, and distribute the code, and it costs absolutely nothing. Because of this dynamic, Unix tends to be pretty rigid and tied specifically to enterprise hardware, while Linux is incredibly adaptable and runs literally everywhere. This whole open source versus closed source model, it completely changed the trajectory of the tech world.
To really grasp why that matters so much, we have to talk about the kernel. Technically speaking, the kernel is the absolute core of any operating system. Think of it as the engine of the car. It sits right there between your software and your physical hardware. With Unix, that engine is a vendor-controlled black box. Big companies like Oracle or IBM, they decide what gets updated and exactly when. But with Linux, the kernel is this massively collaborative community engine. Thousands of developers globally, people from Google, Intel, Red Hat, plus tons of independent coders, they are constantly updating it. That massive community is Linux's absolute superpower.
Which naturally leads us to Part 4. Where do these systems actually live?
Now let's take these concepts out of the abstract for a second. Today, Unix is typically found in massive enterprises, big banks, and huge research institutions, where having rock-solid, predictable reliability is absolutely critical. We're talking big names like Oracle's Solaris, Hewlett-Packard's HP UX, and IBM's AIX. Oh, and here's a super fun fact for you. Apple's Mac OS is actually a certified Unix system. So yeah, if you open up a terminal on a Mac right now, you are quite literally using Unix.
But what about Linux? Well, check out this unbelievable statistic. 100%, absolutely 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers run on Linux. There is no competition. It completely dominates high-performance computing because businesses quickly realized, hey, we can save millions of dollars by switching from these expensive Unix licenses to entirely free Linux systems.
And because Linux is so incredibly portable, it goes way beyond just supercomputers. It is quite literally everywhere. You have an Android smartphone? That runs on the Linux kernel. Roughly 96% of the world's top web servers, they run Linux. Massive cloud platforms like AWS and Google Cloud? Linux. Smart TVs, home routers, and yes, literally NASA rovers exploring other planets? They all run Linux. It powers virtually everything, from tiny little embedded devices all the way up to the most massive enterprise servers on Earth.
All right, let's look at Part 5, Common Ground and Commands.
Here is the really good news. Despite their massive philosophical differences, if you learn one, you are basically learning a ton about the other. Both Unix and Linux follow what are called POSIX standards. That's just a set of rules defining how these kinds of systems should behave. So if you open up a terminal in either one, the experience is incredibly similar. They both organize files in a root tree structure, and those classic commands you might have heard of, like ls to list files, cd to change directories, or grep to search, they work the exact same way on both. So if you learn Linux commands, you can comfortably sit down and navigate a Unix system too. Let's wrap this all up with Part 6, Security, Support, and Your Choice.
When things inevitably break because, hey, it's tech, they always do, or when a new security vulnerability is found, how do these systems handle it? Well, with Unix, updates are completely vendor-controlled. You have to wait for an official patch from the company, but in return you get highly structured, dedicated corporate support. Linux takes a totally different many eyes approach. Because the code is open, thousands of security researchers are reviewing it constantly, which means vulnerabilities often get patched incredibly fast, sometimes in hours. For support, you're usually relying on that massive online community, or you can buy paid enterprise services from companies like Red Hat.
So, bringing this all together, I like to think of it like this. Unix is the wise elder. It laid the foundation for everything. It's powerful, it's formal, and yes, it's expensive. Linux is the energetic offspring. It took all those brilliant original ideas and became wildly adaptable, entirely free, and is absolutely dominating the modern tech world today. If you're looking to get into cloud computing, DevOps, or cybersecurity right now, Linux is without a doubt the undeniable starting point. And honestly, the best part of all of this, it is completely free to learn. You can go online and download a distribution like Ubuntu or Linux Mint right now at absolutely zero cost. So my final question to you is this. Which terminal are you going to open first? Dive right in, start playing around with those commands, and experience the actual power of the command line for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, happy learning!